This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern.
And I'm Yael Barda.
Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we simply cannot thank you enough. This interview is being recorded on the sidelines of a conference at Brandeis University's Schusterman Center for Israel Studies titled Democracy and Its Alternatives, The Origin of Israel's Current Crisis. Our guests, fellows at the Schusterman Center's Institute for Advanced Israel Studies, are speaking at the conference, which is organized this year together with the Center for Jewish History in New York. Lihi Ben Shitrit is the director of the Taub Center for Israel Studies at NYU. Her new edited book, The Gates of Gaza, Critical Voices from Israel on October 7th and the War with Hamas, is forthcoming, actually coming out next month in May, by De Gruyter. Listeners of this podcast need no introduction to the other speaker. Dr. Scheindlin is a political consultant and commentator, and most importantly, the former co-host of the Tel Aviv Review. She also has a new book called The Crooked Timber of Democracy in Israel, Promise Unfulfilled. Hello to both of you.
Hi. Hello, it's great to be back.
So, Daniel, let's start with you. Has the 7th of October marked a tectonic shift in the political landscape in Israel?
If by political landscape you mean the party landscape, the party system, and what might happen after the next elections, the answer is probably. Nobody can say definitely, but we should also go back to 2023. The entire year, we had surveys showing that the government that was elected actually in late 2022 had lost its majority in all surveys. And so the decline was already there because of the deeply unpopular attempt to undermine judicial independence and the massive protests that followed and many major disruptions to Israeli life. And so the government was already seen as doing the wrong thing, behaving in an incompetent way, and there had been already a loss of support. After October 7th, that support plunged further. And it has been very, very consistent over time, over all of the surveys, that if elections were held today, the pre-war government would lose. And the parties that had been in the opposition before October 7th would win. Could they form a coalition? Probably, because they would have a lot to work with. Having said that, I have a feeling your question was a little bit deeper than just party politics. And when it comes to the question of whether the entire political landscape has really changed, it will certainly change, I think, with two qualifications. One, in the long run, because the trauma and the devastation of October 7th and the war that followed is so deep that we don't yet know exactly how it will influence people. What we saw during the Second Intifada is that people's attitudes shifted towards the right, but in a double-stage process. First, the left moved to the center over the first year or two, and then over the years to come, more people moved to the right. So these processes could be so deep and take longer time than just an immediate shift in terms of who people really are politically. And the other thing is, I don't think we can say for sure exactly what kind of a political shift it will be. I certainly assessed after October 7th that people would identify more with right-wing politics, more with right-wing policies, and generally be much more emotionally committed to a very militarist and hardline approach and maximalist on territory. But since October 7th, what we've seen is that the electoral system is gravitating towards the center right, or what Israelis view as the center right, the secular right, the right wing led by a former military chief of staff, Benny Gantz. And so what we're not seeing is a major surge for the extreme right wing faction yet. So all of this could take time, but I have not seen indications of that yet. And that just says that in a longer term sense, there will be a major political impact, but we don't exactly know what form it will take and how long it will take.
Lihi, when you're talking about critical voices from Israel after the attack, do you take anything that Dalia just said into consideration? Is this really against this backdrop of where Israeli politics is going?
Well, I don't know. And I think you have more to predict with because you're dealing with the surveys. I'm just observing Israeli politics and I'm in conversation with people in Israeli politics, but I don't want to make predictions about what we're going to see, what is the outcome and implications. I can more talk about critical voices in terms of where it came from, where this project came from. And that was on October 8th, I was on a panel. I was supposed to be on a panel about the judicial overhaul in 92nd Y. It's a cultural institution in New York with Itamar Rabinovich, Richard Haas, diplomats, people who deal with international relations. And we were supposed to talk about the judicial overhaul, but it was October 8th, right? October 7th, we woke up to the worst attack that Israel has ever experienced, on its soil, and the largest number of civilians dead. I was in shock. I think the other panelists were in shock too, and we shifted to talk about that. So
the panel took place.
The panel took place. They didn't cancel the panel, but instead of talking about the judicial overhaul, they talked about Israel at war. And at the time, I remember we knew about 700 people dead, over 100 people hostage. We didn't even know the full picture. But they asked me what should happen next, while we are in the midst of this. And I said, October 8th, I said, ceasefire. First thing, ceasefire. Then I said, a prisoners exchange, release everyone you have and bring all of them home now. That's what I said, October 8th. And then I said, then think, how do we respond to this? What is the strategy? The first strategy, of course, has to be a reconfiguration of Israeli government so that the most dangerous elements of it are out, dangerous elements that actually have no security or military experience, right? Recomposition of the Israeli government. Pause, think, plan, and of course, think about other events from recent history where a military action in response to a terrible terrorist attack was tried and always failed, right? And everybody was talking about 9/11, right? So 9/11, we know what happened after 9/11. U.S. goes to Afghanistan and stays there for 20 years, and the Taliban is back in power. We know that that's how it works. So and also I said, Bibi Netanyahu released 1,000 prisoners for Gilad Shalit. There's hope. I had hope for him. I had hope for the Israeli government. I had hope for the Israeli polity in terms of what the response. And I thought the things I was saying made sense. And then as days passed, all of a sudden, all of these things that I was saying became very controversial. They were controversial in Israel, not me, saying things like that, saying ceasefire, saying release all the prisoners and bring all the hostages back, saying think before you plan a huge military engagement without thinking about the consequences, the day after, exit strategy, pause and strategize. That became very, very controversial, and it became very controversial in the US as well, right? If you are pro-Israel or you support Israel or you have an affiliation and attachment to Israel, Israel has the right to defend itself. That was the only thing that was acceptable, I felt, in the discourse, in the pro-Israel discourse. And I was a bit at a loss, right? I was at a loss as things were unfolding around us, and we know where they've led, and we know what is the outcome. And from that loss, I was searching for voices in Israel that were still thinking clearly, logically, strategically, while also being in so much pain and grieving and trauma and loss, but that did not make them stop, think critically about political decisions, about next steps. And that's where this project came from. Where it's going to lead, I don't know. But in terms of critical voices, all of the chapters in this book are timed with the dates in which they were written. And I think at each point, it's an intervention that had it been heeded, we would have been in a different situation today.
Sort of a chronicle.
It's sort of a chronicle.
6 months of the
and different trajectories we could have taken and have not been taken.
You edited this book about critical voices of 7th of October, and you had just finished your book on the crooked timber of democracy in Israel. And what's, I think, really hard to articulate is the relationship between the two. What is the relationship between the attempt to decimate Israel's democracy and the war, and also particularly to the incompetence and the abandonment that led to this massive set of casualties that took place on 7th of October. So I want to ask about the relationship between so putting your books in conversation in 5 minutes.
Sure. I mean, I think that the relationship is clear. There's a long-term and deep-rooted connection between the attempts to weaken the independence of the judiciary, which is one way of putting it. The other way of putting it is consolidating power in the hands of the executive and, destroying all gatekeepers or constraints, and the ongoing occupation, which I'll try to explain what I mean. But there's also an immediate context, which is what happened over the course of 2023 with the government that was trying to do those things. I think we have to understand that the judicial overhaul, okay, this is the most neutral term I think we can give to it other than the government's term reform, or what some people would like to say regime coup, which I basically agree with. I should put it out there. But that attempt was not ever really the end game for its own sake. It was a means for the government to have as much possible power and as few possible constraints to advance a particular agenda. And the agenda, I see it as building on what Israel had been doing in many ways for years, or at least dilemmas that Israel had been struggling with for years. And this government, to its credit, one might say, was very open about its agenda of trying to make Israel a more theocratic society, a society that grounded inequality in law. And we should remember that Israel does not have any law guaranteeing the equality of all citizens to this day. So kind of tipping in that, making the decision on that issue in favor of inequality, which essentially would make Jews, give them superior legal status in Israel, and annexing the occupied territories, which they said quite openly in their coalition agreements, as well as gutting the welfare state. And to do that, all those things, legitimizing people in government who in normal governing practices shouldn't have been legitimized. For example, people who either have been convicted of criminal offenses or standing trial for corruption. So all of that agenda together was the reason for the judicial overhaul. And of course, the ability for the government to decide on how to continue expanding Israeli presence, occupying, controlling, and essentially annexing de facto the West Bank, certainly, and of course the kinds of people in government who are religious extremists would have liked the entire, eventually, territory to be under permanent Israeli control, was a central feature in that, maybe even the central feature, although it's hard to really quantify which was their bigger goal. And again, these are long-term aims of the Israeli government. How do we know? Because of the results. We see exactly where the settlement project has gone, 700 or more, roughly 700,000 settlers across the Green Line, and settlements spread everywhere, and of course all other Israeli infrastructure and all branches of the Israeli government involved in implementing the occupation over the years basically says that most governments were going in that direction, but they didn't want to say it explicitly because they knew it was a controversial violation of international law, put Israel in big dilemma with relation to democracy. That's why it's a big theme in my book throughout the years, how that regime evolved, what is the interaction between an occupation regime which is not democratic and the state arms doing it. But in 2023, so those are the long-term aims. And so I think they're inextricable, in fact. A government comes along that says, we want to actually do this. We want to make this decision. We don't want to hide it anymore. If we go as far as we want to go, surely there will be constraints on our policies. They will largely come from the court because those who have been opposed to the occupation over the years have largely taken the claims to the Supreme Court. And so one of the first things they have to do is undercut the Supreme Court and other arms of the judiciary. That created the big backlash because, of course, the rest of Israeli society, and I mean a majority in all surveys were against this, realized that it was a very, very deep threat to their individual rights on many levels, right? Not just about occupation. In fact, the protests famously mostly didn't talk about the occupation. But that's because people knew that their gains that had been made in Israeli society over the years, for example, gender equality and LGBT equality, and the potential for progressive gains that helped individual rights were all under threat now. And so people came out en masse, and they became so panicked that they undertook tactics that really were incredibly effective. Mass mobilization, which really in many ways disrupts the normal rhythms of life and the economy in society. They managed to call strikes, and that left society in an extraordinary state of, semi-functioning. And then, of course, there was the great threat of people not showing up for reserve duty, which is unprecedented. It had never been legitimized in Israeli mainstream society before. And I think all of these created such deep internal discord that the government, instead of rolling back, the government eventually slowed down this plan and was forced to kind of take it incrementally. But instead of really announcing formally, we are not going to do this, or we're going to basically admit that we're not going to do most of it, the government essentially stuck to its principles, became very single-minded, and neglected numerous other areas of governance. Okay, so that I think that even as somebody who, over the years, I've been cautious about how the security and existential threat narrative can be manipulated in Israeli society. as a citizen, you would have been worried throughout 2023. Many of us said, Israel does have opponents and enemies, and if I were them, this would be a vulnerable time. And I guess it wasn't rocket science. So we have to look at the long term and the very immediate precipitating factors.
Yeah, I also think those two things are very, very connected. And for me, during just observing the protest, and I didn't take part in the protest, but I was observing it, it was very strange to me, the fact that the issue of the occupation seemed to be on the sideline. Of course, there's a Gush Neged HaKibush, and it was there, but it wasn't focused on. And that seemed to me baffling, given that we know who's behind the judicial overhaul. Exactly what Daria was saying, right? These are people who, one of the things I've been working on together with Professor Merav Jones is looking at the issues of the magazine Sovereignty, which is an important settler magazine that has come out in the last, I think, 10 years, where you have people writing you have the settlers leadership, but you also have members of parliament, members of Knesset from the Likud, from Shas, from Kulanu, from Kochal Lavan, for all sorts of arrangements from the center to the right, talking about sovereignty and what is the meaning of sovereignty, and what sovereignty means is Jewish sovereignty in the West Bank, right? A transformation from creating facts on the ground to changing legislation in order to potentially eventually annex the West Bank. And that was the people that were behind the judicial overhaul. And it's not a surprise that the Kohelet Forum, their motto is national sovereignty, individual liberty. They're telling you that, national sovereignty. And we know what sovereignty means. Sovereignty means annexation of the West Bank. So it was surprising to me that wasn't front and center in the protest because of who's promoting that.
And now, do you think the 7th of October gave impetus to those powers or curtailed them?
So what I thought first in October 7 is, oh my God, this is a wake-up call, right? It's a wake-up call that all these lefties that kept telling us that we're not going to have a normal life as long as the Palestinians don't have a normal life, and we're not going to have a democracy as long as the occupation continues, they were proven right? All these alarmists were telling us that we're unsafe, even though we are enjoying our life and we have good quality of life and we're very happy in Israel. We are unsafe. This is untenable. I thought that the first thing would be like, oh my God, they were right. That's what everybody might be saying. What worries me now is looking back at those issues of sovereignty and looking at how the right has been talking about annexation and Israeli sovereignty. I was thinking, where was Gaza? Gaza was never mentioned, right? And there were a lot of talks about demography and how will we work with the new demographics and how would we deal with the Palestinians in the West Bank. Gaza didn't exist in this discourse, and that also allowed for a demographic kind of vision where Palestinians are not going to be a majority, even if you annex it, because they never counted Gaza and they never talked about Gaza.
Wait, yes. But that's on the one hand. But on the other hand, one of the interesting things is that the instigators of the regime coup, judicial overhaul, depending on whose side you're on, were Kohelet.
Yes.
And the leadership of Kohelet would speak about the return of Gush Katif as their ultimate goal.
Just to say, Kohelet is a think tank that gave many of these ideas to the government and the people who were trying to promote the judicial overhaul, etc.
Right, and so so on the one hand, I think, of course, it seemed like Gaza was on the moon and nobody was discussing it. But on the other hand, the very people that were really navigating a lot of the shifts were people whose major dream, I think it's Orit Struk, one of the ministers, who says in an interview that the goal is way before the 7th of October, that the goal is to return to Gaza and to settle it, despite the fact that it would take many, many victims.
Right.
Now, how do you think of these things? And of course, we can have paradoxes and contradictions. And no, I don't think that there is the kind of ultimate design to the whole thing. But how does Gaza still relate to this kind of vision?
So can I answer that? Because I think that's true. The Gush Katif was not absent from these publications, right? Gaza was. And what was interesting is when they talk about the West Bank, they talk about the demographic problem of having so many Palestinians. When they talk about Gush Katif, they didn't talk about Gaza. They didn't talk about any demographic problem of 2 million Palestinians there. And now, I am very scared, right? Because I understand that the vision was to go back to Gush Katif, but there wasn't a conversation of what would happen with the 2 million Palestinians that are there. In the West Bank, there are ideas. There are all sorts of ideas of how to give them Hamula authorities, little enclaves. There are ideas about how to deal with the demographic issue. There's no conversation about the demographic issue in Gaza. And that, to me, implies two things. Either that there was an understanding that there is going to be some kind of a mini-state, a Hamas mini-state in Gaza. Israel will have the Gush Katif, and Hamas will control the rest of the Gaza, and that was the arrangement that the Israeli right had, right? In the absence of Hamas, what is the vision? And I think it's what we're seeing now, and that's what really terrifies me and scares me. And I hope, again, that this is something that's not going to not be apparent to the wider Israeli public when they are viewing the war in Gaza, how it's been run, how it's been mismanaged, and what are the goals of the leaders who are executing this war.
Well, luckily, we don't have to guess at that entirely because they have been participating in an extremely public conference, which they tried very hard to get lots of publicity for, including members of the Likud government and, of course, religious Zionism and Jewish power members, calling for annexation of Gaza and rebuilding settlements. I'm calling for reoccupation of Gaza and rebuilding settlements, which is the same thing. So we don't even have to guess, and the Israeli public should know it. If they don't, it's their
fault. But the question is whether it still has any stock within the Israeli electorate and also Israel's more international network. I mean, that's really what's going to cause
Israel's international network right now is in ruins. Mm-hmm. Okay, this is one thing that really has changed since October 7th, at least in terms of how they feel about Israel. Israel's best allies are extremely angry and impatient with Israel's conduct of the war and looking for ways to push Israel out of it, although they have not significantly ratcheted up the policy tools being used. There is just a beginning stage as we're talking now. And in terms of the Israeli public, I mean, I have been surprised by survey research pretty consistently with different kinds of questions, showing many more people than I, as a pollster with 25 years of polling behind me, on issues of the conflict, was surprised to see how many Israelis would support rebuilding settlements in Gaza and reoccupying. And in numerous surveys, it's been 45% to over 50%, which I have to say, if you'd asked me a year ago, I think most Israelis just thought that would have been like a completely far out idea. But this is an immediate effect of October 7th, I think.
Okay, Lihi Ben Shitrit, Dr. Scheindlin, thank you very much for this.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Goodbye.